Okay, static variables. This is a topic that we will be covering for the rest of the lesson. Okay, I'll create a new project and then I'll come back to this one because there are some things that I want to show you here regarding these circles. We want to make a couple of different methods still. So yeah, I'll come back to this one. I'll create a new one for today. So this is lesson, what? Lesson like 12 or something. I'll open this in new window because I want both windows to be open for later consumption. Okay, and now we will create a class here. I'll create a package as we always do. I'll call it models, or I don't know, whatever you want to call it. And I'll create a vehicle here. So yeah, we'll be creating a vehicle. What do we want for our vehicle? Well, what type of information? Well, for starters, we want every vehicle to have a unique ID. That's one of our requirements. You know, every vehicle must have unique ID, and we must take care of that ourselves. You know, we are not depending on the user to provide IDs. We don't even want to allow the user to provide IDs. That's all done internally. So what can we do? Well, I'll just do print. Let's do integer ID. So every vehicle will have an ID. Maybe we will add some more things to the vehicle later. I don't know, like every vehicle has a maker, so we can say private string maker, and maybe every vehicle has a name or a model, you know, string model. And then later we will extend vehicle to add some more things to it and so on. But for now, this is enough. You know, we just want every vehicle to have a unique ID, and we want to know the maker and the model, and then we can make like a land vehicle or a flying vehicle or a, I don't know, truck, car, and so on. We can make a hierarchy out of that. But basically, this is common for every vehicle, so we put that here. Since every vehicle we wanted to have an ID and these two pieces of data, right? So now what can we do? Well, we can construct, I mean, our object. Let's make a constructor. But as we already said, we kind of don't want to allow the user to input any kind of ID. So what, like if he inputs 50 and we already have 50, we could make a change and like remember all the vehicles that we've made. But there's also a better way to do this. And we can have a static variable, and a static variable here would mean that it doesn't belong to one instance of the class. It would belong to the whole class. There would be only one copy of it for the whole class. So if I do static int next ID, you will usually see static variables uppercase, like caps lock and camel case. That's the convention for naming them, you know. I mean, to just differentiate them from regular variables, which use camel case, like this model and something, you know, they use camel case and start with a lowercase letter always. Again, this is just convention, and if you are ever going to work in a real firm, you will have to follow conventions because, I mean, it's just commonly accepted. Everybody does it this way, you know. I mean, there's nothing wrong with naming this lowercase, but just don't do it, please, because it's breaking the convention. Okay, and maybe some programmer won't even let you include that code into the project, you know. Okay, so again, let's explain thoroughly what does static mean for this variable. When we're creating vehicles here, when we're doing vehicle va1 equals new vehicle and so on, now I have to pass some things. I'll change this later. And I create vehicle 2 and so on. You know, every vehicle itself will have each of these variables, a copy of each of these variables. So every vehicle will have its own ID, its own maker, its own model, you know, and we can pass them in with the constructor and so on. And we can even make sure they are different, but we will do that in our class. Now, the thing is, when we create as many vehicles as we want, this variable only exists once for the whole class, you know. So if I like to print out, let's make something just like, let's make ID, a getter for ID. I want to print out ID. So v1.getID, and that will just be its own copy. v2.getID will be its own copy of the ID. And if I do sout v1, now let's just briefly make this public so we can access it. v1.next ID. Here, it'll just give us a warning, and I'll explain that warning in a bit. But now let's do v1.next ID equals 5. And now let's print out v2.next ID and see what happens, you know. And then I'll explain. Okay, it says 1205. Let's explain that. Obviously, we passed in 1 for vehicle 1's ID, we passed 2 for vehicle 2's ID. So v1 get ID, v2 get ID, return exactly those values, 1, 2. v1 next ID was initialized by 0 by default. I don't have to write it, but it's 0 by default because it's an integer, right? So printing that out here, prints out 0. Then changing it on v1 to 5 reflects that change on v2 as well. What does this mean? Well, this means that this variable is shared among the whole class. There's only one copy of that, There is not a particular version tied to every vehicle, as we saw for ID and for everything else that's non-static. So that's the difference between static and non-static variables. Is that clear so far? So I can move on now to how to properly access them, and why you can and cannot access something from something else, That's really important. So now, first we see a warning here. So let's say what does this warning tell us? This is allowed but discouraged. Warnings are usually that, something that's fine by design of the programming language, but not really encouraged because it might kind of be misleading or something, Here it's kind of misleading, we're changing v1 next ID, v2 next ID. It's kind of misleading because they actually are the same thing. The proper way to access next ID is via the class name, vehicle.nextID. So because it belongs to the class, we access it this way, this exists even if the class wasn't created. A single instance doesn't have to be created, and vehicle.nextID will still exist, while ID will not even exist because there's no vehicles at all, So this exists regardless of any vehicle, it's there, it's just there. So the proper way to access it is by the class name and then .nextID. We can access it this way though, because every instance of the class, has access to it, So this is a way to access it, but discouraged, but possible, We will see later how in static things we cannot access non-static, but we can vice versa. And it will make sense because this class has its own fields, and this, while something static, only has access to this because it doesn't have access to the fields because it's static. There's only one of it per class, So we'll see later in a table here. There will be a table at some point like this. What can access what, And we will check that out shortly. So now, yeah, I have explained what's the difference between static and non-static variables. And now how can we, I just wanted to show you here how we can use them, but we're going to get rid of this because that was just for an example. But now in the vehicle class, how can we use this? Well, it's interesting. Every time we create the ID, we're not going to allow the user to pass in the ID. We're only going to allow him to pass the maker and the model of a vehicle, right? We will take care of the ID ourselves. So what can we do? We can say this ID equals next ID. So basically start off at 0, or we can start off at 1 if we want to, We don't want 0 IDs, so we will start just counting normal numbers. And what can we do now? Well, we can do next ID plus plus. What does this do? This assigns our copy of the ID to next ID. So our first vehicle will have the ID of 1. And then it will increase the shared variable that's shared between all instances of vehicle. So next time another vehicle is trying to get created, we will just say this.id equals 2, because this will be changed by the previous one, and it'll retain that value because it's there only once. There's a shared variable between all instances of the class, So the ID of the next vehicle will be 2, and it'll increase next ID to 3 to be ready for the next vehicle when it's created, Does this make sense so far?